Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 329 of the podcast. It's January 21st, 2019. Joining me today is Mike Eisenberg. He is the director, editor, and producer of the film To Err is Human, a documentary about the incredibly important issue of patient safety. The film shares a title with the groundbreaking 1999 report from the Institute of Medicine. Again, To Err is Human. The film will be available tomorrow as a digital download through Apple iTunes, and it's also available as a Blu-ray or DVD through Amazon. There will also be screenings taking place around the country, and you can arrange one at your health system or other event, because I think this is something, hopefully, that our communities get engaged in, not just healthcare professionals. In the film, Eisenberg was able to interview many people who are very familiar to me, including Dr. Don Berwick, Captain Sully Sullenberger, Lucian Leap, and two people I've interviewed in previous podcasts, Dr. Bob Wachter and Leah Binder. Endorsements for the film come from some other really big names in this movement, including Dr. Atul Gawande, who said about the film, "We invest tens of billions to find cures for disease, but barely a fraction of that to find cures for one of the world's biggest killers, medical errors. This important documentary conveys just how big a mistake that is. It also shows how we can do better. For the problem isn't bad clinicians. It's the complexity that good clinicians have to deal with every day." So in our conversation about the film, Mike and I talk about the scale and the breadth of patient safety problems, some of the systemic causes, and some of the solutions that are being tried and used in healthcare. Now, the term lean is not a part of the film, but Mike has said to me that he's aware of the alignment between lean and systemic patient safety improvement. But as I understand, there are limitations to what could be put into a 77-minute film. But there are common themes, including not blaming bad apples and improving the way care is delivered in a systematic way. I had the opportunity to watch the film before the interview. It's very powerful. It's well produced. I hope you'll check it out, whether you're a patient or a healthcare professional or leader. It's important that we help the public understand that patient safety can't be taken for granted, and it's important that hospitals step up their efforts on this front. So if you'd like to find links to the film and other things I've mentioned, you can go to leanblog.org/329, or the website for the film is toerrishumanfilm.com. Thanks for listening.
Mike, hi. Thank you so much for being a guest and being here to talk about such an important topic today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So, there's so much we can get into today, but I would just love to hear your story as a filmmaker, individual, as an individual, as a person. What inspired you to tackle this topic?
It's a mix of a few things, but really it started in 2015. I had sort of been looking around for our next film. And when I say we, I'll say that a lot. We is myself, Matt, and Kaylee, who are my two co-producers, and we work together with our own production company in Chicago. And we're kind of looking for a story to tell. It's what we do. And looking inward is always a helpful way to do that. And I was thinking about my father a little bit at that time, because I had read an article about the AHRQ, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, potentially getting defunded. And this is an article that tends to be sort of regurgitated every year. But at that point, I sort of saw it with a different set of eyes and thought, well, maybe this is a story that we should tell. Not a lot of people know about this agency, and they certainly don't understand how important the work that they do is to the quality of healthcare in this country. So let's go interview them. Let's go interview the people who worked with my dad when he ran that agency and find out what's going on. And for some additional context, my dad passed away in 2002. So, I was 17 at the time. I didn't have a significant interest in health policy or healthcare in general. And over the years, I've sort of seen how much it really involves itself in everyone's lives. But I still didn't know much about patient safety or preventable mistakes. The statistics that we present in the film were fairly new to me. And so we went out to DC. We interviewed people like Carolyn Clancy, Lisa Simpson, Helen Burston, a handful of others who had all sort of worked with my father and are now in areas of healthcare that tap into different pieces of the puzzle. And as we were interviewing them, we realized that this is a much bigger picture to paint than just AHRQ. How can we tell the story of patient safety, which really hadn't been told, in my opinion, in a productive way that showed solutions, but also engaged both patients and providers with the same messaging. So our goal was transformed into, now let's find the experts in patient safety. Let's travel the country and interview them, but also find examples of these efforts and show what it looks like when people are actually putting in the effort to fix preventable mistakes. And outside of all that, we have to do something as filmmakers to make it more than just, a PowerPoint presentation of solutions. So we connected with the Sheridan family, whose story is told throughout the film, and we tried to really branch out their story into much more than just the incident that happened, but actually follow them as a family, how that incident has changed them and turned them into this empowered family that is now on a mission to make sure that the same things don't happen to other people.
Yeah, and so the problem of harm, deaths caused by medical error, and in particular preventable medical error. I mean, you say a lot of people didn't or don't know about AHRQ. A lot of people don't know about what in a lot of circumstances would be called a crisis. We could call this maybe a patient safety crisis. Families, I've met far too many people like the Sheridans who think what has happened to their loved one is maybe a really rare, isolated incident, when it's often too frequent and too systemic, or very systemic problem. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about framing the impact on families, and I imagine there were other families you met, and you chose the Sheridans. How do you think about their individual story, plus then the context of the statistics?
Right. And I think that those two things are very married in a way that people don't tend to think about. When we get these numbers that are really huge, whether they're estimates or whether they're calculated one by one, people lose they see the big picture, they lose the small intimate stories that really change lives. One person is harmed, it affects 15 to 20 other people who are now, alerted to this thing they didn't even know existed in the first place. Now, it's so important to tell those stories. And when we were really kind of kicking the can around in our heads about how to do that, we thought, well, why don't we use 6 or 7 different patient stories as these sort of, chapter breaks in our film. And we'll sort of say, okay, well, here's something that happened over here, and then showcase a solution. And if we had done that, it would have been great to maybe even do this as an episodic thing, like 6 or 7 episodes to tell different stories of patient safety rather than one film. You can see how many different directions the documentary can go. But we thought, well, if you do that, if you just kind of reduce these people to the incident or the headline, then you really don't get to the core of what we believe can help solve some of these issues, which is what happens next, how it affects the family, and how deep this impact goes. So when we were looking for that story, the Sheridans were this perfect blend of not only empowerment, but also a deep connection to my father. I didn't actually know this until after I reached out to her, but she was given her first platform in the year 2000 at a summit that my father hosted on medical error, which was sort of spurred on by that, at that time, the 1998-99 Two Errors Human report by the Institute of Medicine that really kicked things off. So he set up a big summit with a long panel of experts, but then he also gave the patients a voice, and that voice at that time was Sue Sheridan. It's her first chance to tell her story. And her story, in a nutshell, it was, her son, Cal, has cerebral palsy. At that time, he was 5 years old. due to, the absence of a $27 test that easily could have been and should have been done to test his bilirubin levels and notice that they were too high, take the necessary steps after that, and prevent the brain damage from escalating and now giving him lifelong cerebral palsy.
Mm-hmm.
But she also had a second incident in which her husband, Pat, died from cancer, which the proper diagnosis was delayed 6 months after they had done the initial tests because some of the paperwork did not follow through on the channels that they should have and got sort of lost in the shuffle. And that's 6 months that he could have had treatment. So when I say all this, though, what I think really gets lost in the messaging of the numbers is, the research that we sort of take into the film is the biggest number of as many as 440,000 die every year from medical error, which was the 2012 study by John James. There's been something more recently, which happened during the making of our film, so it was a little late for us to include it, but also, we can get into those semantics another time, which was the Johns Hopkins one that went a little bit more specific and said 251,000. But what I think is really important is for people to understand, especially when they don't agree with those numbers, which happens often,
mm-hmm.
is that, Pat Sheridan died from cancer. There's no doubt about that. His death certificate says that he died from cancer, that he died from the specific kind that he had. But when you really look at the big picture of his death, what would have been different had he gotten treatment 6 months earlier? Would he have lived longer? Could he have survived the cancer? And this is something that happens all over the country all the time. Mm-hmm. And so, even someday, when people who aren't killed by an error specifically, but an error changes the course of their life, their whole life is changed. It will never show up on their death certificate. That's not something the CDC does. Mm-hmm. But it's made this issue extremely complicated and a lot tougher to diagnose as an issue because we're not able to really specifically show, well, this person died because of that medical error. Mm-hmm. So when you really look at it all, I think one of the biggest things that we want to get across to people is this issue is about one person at a time. Mm-hmm. And it's not just what happens, it's what happens next. And it's the responsibility of everybody to step in and say, what happened here and how can we prevent it from happening again? And again and again and again, and just becoming something that we ignore and assume is part of healthcare, because in many cases it's not.
Right, and situations like this, I've read and heard many stories about people assuming. So I assumed no news was good news. They didn't hear anything back about the results of a biopsy or a test. And what happened was exactly what happened to Pat Sheridan, where something was lost in the shuffle. There wasn't, an airtight communication pathway between pathology and the physician and the patient. So people think about things like this as being maybe a 1 in a million chance, but the odds, forget the number you cite in the film, but the odds of being subject to an error in the course of a hospital stay are really high. I've seen different estimates to say 1 in 300 patients get harmed during an admission, and that who knows what the exact number is, but this is something that's clearly occurring every day, probably in every hospital in the United States and other developed countries.
I think there's a great analogy to the car industry here. In the film, we go forth with the aviation analogies and comparisons, which has really taken a lot of attention in this issue. But there are other industries that are great ones to look at. The car industry being one that for so many years said, well, people crash, people die in cars, it happens. Let's try and make people better drivers and they'll figure it out. And, I wasn't around at the time, but Ralph Nader had something to do with it, as I understand. And, the transition into making cars safer because humans are not reliable to get better was a huge transformation in that industry. And when they realized that instead of relying on people to be perfect, let's make the cars protect the people when they make mistakes is such a perfect analogy. And I think about it a lot nowadays. It was only brought to my attention after we finished the film. And when you look at, there are so many different reasons why people crash in a car, but the cars are all built to withstand those incidents. If you're drunk and you're negligent, that's different. That's very tough to create a system that can prevent that kind of thing from happening. And that's where I think a lot of people get caught up as well when they're not familiar with this issue. They think, well, medical errors are negligent doctors. They're bad doctors. They're people who are trying to hurt you, and they should be kicked out of the health industry. Well, yeah, they should. But our film never we don't go near that, because when you really look at this thing, you realize that there are far more good doctors, good nurses, good surgeons making errors that they might not even know they're making, simply because the system's set up in a way to allow those errors to reach the patient. And it's not until the patient feels that error, the harm is felt by them, that it becomes aware to the team. And so if we can get people to know that this is something that happens, they might be more empowered to prevent that from happening to them. You gave you said something that reminded me of a family member of mine just this week went in for a third Achilles surgery. She's had some tricky complications with the surgery. But what I found most interesting was just the other day, she's going in and they talked about some antibiotic they were going to give her. She knew that was not the correct antibiotic. Mm-hmm. She spoke up, she said something, and she got them to, she convinced them that this was the wrong antibiotic. They didn't believe her at first. Mm-hmm. It's really easy for that kind of mistake to happen, and it probably wouldn't have harmed her, killed her, but she wouldn't have had the proper antibiotic. She wouldn't have had the ability to fight the infection if anything came up. And so this is why it's so important for patients to know about this issue and also see what it looks like when errors happen and how easy it is for them to escalate.
Yeah, and there's this, this human tendency to point fingers of blame. We see this in all sorts of different workplaces. One thing I appreciate about the work of Don Berwick and Bob Wachter and Lucian Leith and others who also appear in the film is that, for a couple of decades now, they've been emphasizing the need to focus on systems, and that when organizations focus on blame and punishment, that does nothing but cover up situations, and then those situations don't get addressed. If people are afraid of being punished for something that might be considered a near miss, that opportunity to improve and prevent something from happening in the future is lost. So I'm glad that point comes through clearly in the film. And another point that was really strong was the idea of I forget who it was who said, because we're human error is bound to happen. And therefore, we need to create systems that are, I'm paraphrasing, create systems that are robust to prevent error from becoming harm. As she said, zero error is never going to happen, but zero harm is much more likely. So I was wondering if you could, maybe elaborate on some of that point, or what you learned from the patient safety experts in the film.
There was a lot of learning going on during the making of this film for us. We don't come from a medical background. The closest we do is the papers and stacks of papers on the floor in my dad's office that I had to step over when I wanted to see him. This is news to us. And so I think that also gave us the chance to ask questions that people may not be asking within healthcare because they're familiar enough with it. So, this is, we go into the Swiss cheese model in this film, and I think that's a good place to go here. This is not always a case of knowing what kind of errors are occurring or that you even made one in the first place, but understanding the power of the team in making sure that somebody is speaking up, and that we have more than one set of eyes looking at the process. That's not to say that, examples in our film like the surgical black box are the solution to every problem. It's not. Big Brother is not the solution to all of our issues or anything like that, but understanding where humans are imperfect is really at the core of it. We interviewed a psychologist in the film who goes into, just the general convincing of you as the audience member that, look, you're not perfect, you're going to make mistakes. We didn't name this film To Err Is Human because of the report. We named it because that is really the core still of this problem 20 years later. And if we can all work together to acknowledge that humans just can't deliver perfection, and they certainly can't deliver it when the system that they're working in isn't supporting that. There's a great saying that, all systems are designed to achieve exactly what they achieve. I'm totally misquoting it, but that's so
they get the results that the system is designed to produce. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And without that team approach, without really being able to step back and look at what's happened, you just can't possibly see the mistakes. And it's very difficult for us in the moment to know that we did something wrong. You just keep trucking through. And especially when we're talking about surgery, in which, every moment is important. That's where teamwork is so important. But even on the less dramatic side, diagnosis, it's also a team sport. It involves a litany of, it involves a ton of people down the line that all have to do their job right. And it's not their job to follow up with the person that they're supposed to send something to make sure that person got it. Right. And that's kind of what happens with Pat, with his cancer diagnosis. It wasn't the job of the pathologist to call the physician to make sure that he got the information and relayed it to the patient. It's his job to just make sure that the facts went through or something like that. And that's where these errors happen. And they happen in the regular workplace. They happen in conversations with spouses. But when you're talking about healthcare, there's a lot more on the line. There's lives are on the line.
Well, I'm reminded of a case that was in the news maybe 10 years ago, a patient, Derry Eason, and this was a case where she was given the wrong test result. She was given a diagnosis of a pretty bad form of breast cancer based on the pathology results from a biopsy, and they had a second reading of the wrong report, and that wasn't the right solution. But she was rushed into surgery, and after a radical double mastectomy, was told, well, the good news is you never had cancer to begin with. And they traced it back to a mislabeling of a slide in pathology. And even though my background is engineering, I've had the opportunity to go and observe people working in labs. They have the sample, they create thin slices, they put it on a slide, and at some point that slide has to be labeled. And I've seen too many settings where the risk of error is way too high, whether somebody's handwriting a number on a slide or whether it's being printed. A lot of times this work gets done in batches. And I was in a different lab. This is not the lab from the Derry Eason case, but you could see, I'm thinking through, there's a risk that skilled, attentive, well-trained medical technologist is going to grab the wrong slide because they had 3 different slides for 3 different patients in their field of work. And I asked the lab manager about this risk of error. This is how engineers are trained to think. This could go wrong. We need to prevent that risk. And the lab manager, without pause, she said, oh, well, no, that's okay. My people are really careful. And so I think there's a couple different layers of the problem. You could say, well, the cause of the error in a case like Derry Eason's was bad process. The cause of these problems not being fixed comes back more, I think, to some of the mindsets of leaders of not recognizing, well, your people are careful, but they're human. They're going to make a mistake at some point. And it's not sufficient to wait until the error occurs and then punish that person for being human.
Mm-hmm. Making this case is tough too, because we need to engage the patients in this conversation. And most people in this country have no interest in adding another responsibility to their healthcare. But that's because they don't understand how valuable they are in the process either. And it's they don't see doctors, nurses, surgeons as human beings, right? They don't, and that's not totally their fault. I think we've been conditioned this way.
Right. Right.
And that's why, I often say that I maybe it's not our film, but I think that this kind of sort of medical education, this what's it called, health literacy, needs to be handled at a much younger age for people. Not only because of the complexity of understanding the system and health insurance and how this is a topic every day in the news and in politics, but because at the most simple level, when you're 18 years old, you very well might be, even younger, you might be called upon by your family to take care of somebody. And if you understand that these people at this hospital or at this nursing home are juggling a lot, they're really trying their best all day, every day. And also they're human and they might have a bad day too, that they need your help. And we all have to work together as a team to prevent these errors from happening. But when I say that, it comes with a caveat. It's not just the patient's responsibility. And the patients are never going to get involved in this process unless the healthcare system opens the door for them. They're not going to pull. We don't need the healthcare system to pull people through the door, yank them in. But the door has to be opened, right? This is a situation in which both sides really need to open up and need to understand how fragile the situation really is, and how it's not going to be fixed just by connecting patients and providers this way. But that's a huge step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And I also think that in many cases, hospitals, systems don't think that it's worth the investment. They don't see why they should spend money on something that patients don't necessarily care about, in their opinion. But that's where films like ours can play a role in helping create awareness about something without trying to drag the system down. Our film is not, or at least we really try not to present these issues in a negative way. We tried to look at my father's career and say, what were some of the most important things to him when he was on television, sending this message to the American people. And in many cases, it was what we've been talking about. It was how easy it is to make a mistake and how we're all human and how we need to work together as a team to make sure that these errors don't keep happening.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not enough for advocates or organizations to lecture patients. You should speak up because, like you said, society conditions people to not question doctors. You even look at some of the language involved, doctors' orders, as opposed to doctors' recommendations or doctors' decisions. And there's, I think, kind of an adjacent side of the patient safety movement. There's an organization called the Society for Participatory Medicine. And I agree with you. It's got to be invited by the hospitals and the doctors on the individual level. There was a hospital I worked with, this is maybe 10 years ago, they did some survey of patients and something like 2/3 of them said they were unwilling to speak up and question a doctor for different reasons. And things like that are going to take time to change.
One of our original poster concepts, and I had scribbled things on paper for a few weeks until we settled on what eventually was our real poster, was a rendition of the Touch of God painting. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, it's the doctor's hand with the stethoscope coming out of the frame and the patient being the human. And I just feel like that was such a good rendition of like how people see the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. And nobody questions. And I think it's okay to be nervous about questioning. I mean, I don't think it's healthy for people to just go on WebMD and come in with a diagnosis and tell their doctor that they're right. But sure. I do think that understanding how to get information before you walk into the doctor's office to say, this is what I've heard, tell me what you think, wouldn't be such a bad thing. More importantly, when people leave our film, I've heard from the general public who've occasionally been able to see the film prior to its release and said, like, now they're going to the hospital and they're seeing the hand washing. They like look for the sink. They're thinking about whether or not they can say, hey, did you wash your hands before you walked in here? Look, we're not talking about someone stopping a syringe of, 800 grams of morphine or whatever, but we're talking about some really simple things that are going to change the behaviors that lead to error, that lead to mistakes and lead to infections.
Yeah, so let's talk more about the solution side of things, because I think in the film, and as you're saying, it's good to recognize that problems are not caused by the proverbial bad apples. Vast majority of the time, these are systems issues related to things like communication, hand hygiene, things that are hardly rocket science or on the edge of medical technology. So what are some of the solutions that you researched and ended up in the film of ways people are trying to reduce harm to patients?
Well, we tried to show a few different examples at each level. We understand that it's too much to expect the most cutting edge technology to solve every problem. Even EHRs created new problems. So that's the nature of technology. But at its most basic, there's a cultural thing that can happen at institutions and hospitals. One of my favorite scenes in the film is one where we're at UC Davis and we're following their physician assistants training program, where they have actual, it's sort of like an actor, but somebody who walks in and plays the role of the patient. And they have a game plan of how they're going to interact with the physician assistant student, but the student doesn't know what's going to happen, and they just have a sort of sheet of paper of what they're supposed to do. Hey, we saw something when we looked back at our scan a few weeks later that we should have noticed the first time, and so we need to do a follow-up. This is not like the most dramatic example on the planet, but it's something that happens every day in healthcare. And how you navigate that conversation is probably the most underutilized skill in healthcare. Teaching doctors, nurses how to speak to patients about an error instead of letting the hospital just sort of sweep it under the rug. And if the patient sues, then we'll just let the lawyers handle it. That's a really complex skill to learn. And it only helps everybody. There's no loser in this situation. And I think that example is a really good one for people to see, because it doesn't cost any money to do it. Maybe if you have to pay the actor, I don't know. But, we also show a higher end version where, in Toronto, there's a surgeon who's taking what he's seen from the aviation industry, applying it into healthcare in a way that's not, like I said before, Big Brother, where, you have cameras in the surgical theater trying to protect the hospital or, give the patient material to sue. That's not what it's about. It's about collecting data. It's about saying, okay, well, how many times was the door open? How many times was the surgery handed off to, an assistant rather than the lead surgeon? Those are things that when they compile them and put them into a data stream, they're able to see where the weaknesses are in their process and then use that information to get better. And more importantly, share that information with other hospitals so that they can start to apply that science to their own. Those are two sort of both ends of the spectrum examples that we have in the film. And there's certainly others, but at the core of them all is about training and teaching about the culture of safety and how we have to think about these issues differently. And, Sue Sheridan's example is one of very specific. Bilirubin tests were not being administered properly, if at all sometimes. And that was her goal, to make sure that was done at every hospital. That's pretty concrete.
Well, and when errors occur, I think it was Sue's story where I forget if it was after, related to Cal or Pat, but was she the one who had the meeting lined up with hospital executives and she showed up and the only person there was the chaplain, which I think that's rude. That's disrespectful. And it seems like that's where people really start to go after an organization when they feel brushed off, ignored, disrespected. I mean, it seems like, there's been a lot of reports that say when a doctor or an organization sincerely apologizes, that the lawsuits go down. And, I think there's a deeper issue where if doctors are not afraid, and if they're taught how to speak about things that have happened to the patient, hopefully that also teaches them to speak about these things internally, of how to raise issues and do something then as a result to prevent harm in the future. I hate to ask if that hospital, yet alone every hospital now, routinely does that test for patients or not. I hate to ask what the follow-up was. I don't know if you know how widespread. Has that become a best practice?
As I understand from a distance, I think yes, and that's mostly due to Sue's persistence. And when we were talking about how to tell her story, we actually thought about in having her sit down and talk to the CEO of that hospital, or somebody who was involved in that care, that lapse in delivery of care. And then we found a news segment in which she had already done that. She had on television sat down face to face with the CEO and said, "Are you going to make sure that this never happens to anybody else?" And he says, "Yes." We can't expect that to happen every time something goes on, but it's a good example of how, the patient involvement can create some accountability that just isn't there without it.
Right.
And to be fair, I'm sure many cases of errors a patient never even found out about. There was a morbidity mortality report, and they talked about it, and they maybe put something in place to prevent an error like that from happening again. I'm sure that happens in a lot of cases at hospitals, but certainly a lot where it doesn't. And that's something that, with the increase of responsibilities that are being put on clinicians, it's making it harder and harder every day for them to be able to step back and ask themselves if they did enough or if they did it right. And so that's why we keep bringing up the patient's role.
Yeah, and there's a number of solutions talked about in the film. I think the idea around checklists, taking lessons from aviation safety. Captain Sully Sullenberger is in the film, and I've met other pilots who do training in operating room settings of teaching people how to speak up in a way that's most likely to be heard. People who are lower in the hierarchy, but then also talking with leaders and surgeons of how to create an environment where it's safe for people to speak up, that everyone is on the same team working for the patient. Cultural aspects like that seem to be as important as tactics in helping
look,
solve this problem.
I know that the majority of people who are listening are likely working in healthcare, and they might be asking themselves, well, why are we talking about the patient so much? What can I do? Well, that's not the right way of thinking about it. And what the patient can do is almost always going to be determined by what the doctor nurse tells them to do. And if the healthcare system isn't telling patients, hey, we need you to be vigilant, we need you to speak up, we need you to look around and say, hey, is what you're seeing correct? And not just for the inpatient, right? For everybody who steps foot in a hospital, and the continuum of care too, which we don't have time in the film to go through, but it's all part of it. It starts with the system and the people who work in it saying, we need your help. And it's hard to do that without acknowledging that there's a problem in the first place. And I totally get why that's a really tough task. It's really difficult to say, you're not safe unless you are looking around. I mean, that's like before you go into an airplane, they're like, they'd kind of do this, but if they were to say, the pilot goes on the speaker and says, I've never had a crash before, but hey, it's possible. So if you see the engine on fire, let me know. That's not going to happen. But it's different when it's one-on-one. And I think we should really start to think about how we can open up that to people so that everybody's involved.
Yeah, and there's different. So I think there's parallels in teaching and encouraging and creating an environment for medical hospital employees to speak up, and teaching patients how to speak up. I mean, I agree with your analogy. I've never had a flight where a pilot comes on and talks about the risks. Like, if you go for surgery, they'll talk about the risk you could die. The pilot doesn't come on board the flight and say, there is a risk that we will crash, and please sign this form. Maybe that's built into buying the ticket. But this idea, like, there have been campaigns that I sort of cringe when I see nurses being encouraged to wear buttons that say to the patient, "Ask us if we've washed our hands." Because to your point, the pilot isn't wearing a button that says, "Ask us if we've double checked the flaps before takeoff." Like, that's the pilot's responsibility. It's the airline's responsibility. Even though when I was a kid growing up in Detroit, there was a Northwest Airlines at that point. A plane that crashed on takeoff at the Detroit airport because the flaps weren't set properly. And that was missed before takeoff. And to aviation's credit, they've built that into checklists, and there's more discipline around the checklists, and not having personal conversations while the plane is taxiing. And aviation has solved one of those problems. But I agree with the people in the I think it was Dr. Ashish Jha who said in the film, it's unfair to ask patients to sort this out, but the reality is that it's necessary. So I think, sorry, I'm going on and on, but bring it back to you, Mike. There's an organization I know you're aware of, a nonprofit that I'm fortunate to be on the board of, the Louise H. Batts Patient Safety Foundation. They're going to be doing a screening of your film in San Antonio, and they do a lot of work, not just to raise awareness, but to produce their BATS guides that help prompt. It's not just the vague idea of you should ask questions, but here are questions that are really helpful. I'm curious, some of your other thoughts on that. I've been babbling instead of asking a question. Sorry.
No, it's a conversation. It's good. We've been trying to, connect with as many organizations like the Louise Batts Foundation as possible, because, they're really at the core of bridging the gap in a way that's productive. And one of the ways we've been doing that is through screenings. And, we're thankful that after a lot of planning and trying to figure out how to do it, we're going to be able to bring the film to Texas for 2 screenings, one in San Antonio, one in Austin, here actually in like a couple, right after the release of the film on the 24th and 25th, I believe. Those screenings are, I think, the most productive way for us to really share the message of this film. And organizations like the Louise Batts Foundation, Helen Haskell does Mothers Against Medical Errors. Sue works with some of them. Sue, who's in the film, works with, the Society for Diagnostic Error in Medicine. There are a lot of organizations, both at the foundational grassroots level, all the way up to sort of these federal subliminal agencies that don't really get a lot of attention. They're all trying to play a role in helping to reduce errors. They're all funded very differently, and they all do very different things for outreach. In my opinion, one of the best ways to create awareness for an issue is first to have a sort of concise way of telling people the problem and the solutions. And that's where documentaries can come in. But having a conversation is so key. And to be able to facilitate screenings and facilitate conversations in which, the audience is a mixed bag, you really find the questions that people ask come from a lot of different areas, but they're all very connected. And usually it comes down to, okay, so now I know in a sort of macro way what's the problem and what it looks like when people are working on it. Okay, so what are we doing here in this region, in this town, in this state? And we've been able to take this film to Boston, LA, New York, Chicago, big cities. But what about all these other ones that all have their own hospital, that all have their own systems that don't ever get Don Berwick or Lucian Leap or the National Patient Safety Foundation. They don't all come out to these towns. They can't. And so our film is able, I hope, to enlighten these smaller communities in a way that can let them just stay focused on what they're doing on a local level. And it's really cool. It's really cool to be able to do that. And, we've been partnering with a lot of organizations and foundations to help do that because we just can't do it on our own.
Yeah. And people can find those dates on the website for the film, toairishumanfilm.com. Yeah, you were Austin on January 23rd, San Antonio on January 24th. There's other dates and events. If somebody wants to, and the film will be released on the 22nd on iTunes and Amazon, but let's say if somebody is listening here, they're working at a hospital, they're on a board, they're involved in some way, is there a process for scheduling a screening at their organization? How can they do that?
Yeah. We have a booking sheet on our website, which is just like a little forum. You say your name and you just briefly tell us who you are and that you want to bring the film to wherever you are. And we give you some information like people still have to license the film because when you buy it on iTunes or Amazon, it's for personal use, technically speaking. So, but we work directly with you. It's me. I'm just going to be the one who's talking to you about, okay, hey, you want to bring the film to University of Texas, San Antonio? Great. Here's a licensing fee. It's not very expensive. And, just sign it. You basically just sign a piece of paper that says, hey, we're going to screen it here. And then we give people all kinds of stuff like marketing materials so they can stay in line with the film. And then we'll work with them on the presentation copy. So I'm very involved and I'll be very interactive with people to do that. And we occasionally are asked to come out to the screenings to be part of the conversation that takes place after. We did 75 screenings in 2018. It was amazing. And we did it without really ever promoting or advertising the film. It was all word of mouth. One place screens it. They tell their friends, colleagues. We screen it at a conference. We get 3 or 4 screenings out of that. And every screening has had a panel discussion after. Yeah. Every single one. And I think it's crucial to do that. And in many cases, it's tough to get people out of the clinical schedule to go see a movie. I get that. It's a 77-minute long movie. It's a feature-length film. It's not, a 20-minute video. Right. It tells a story that's whole and complete. And oftentimes we're asked, hey, can you shorten the film for these people who are super busy? And we say no. We say no. I want everybody to see the film. And I understand that showing 20 minutes of it can be of significant value for anybody who watches it, and I don't want to discredit that. But I think it's really important that if people are going to take this issue seriously and use our film as a way of navigating that conversation, it's important to see the big picture, because we really created this film in a way that I hope people understand how morphed together the patient's story is with the patient's safety story as a whole, and how you can't separate those two. So, that's what the screening conversations do so well, is create a really good way of saying, okay, what are the big issues? And then what are the localized ways we're going to make sure this doesn't happen here?
One other question before we wrap up here. You said the film's 77 minutes long. It's really engaging, real engaging film. But what was one really interesting thing that ended up on the cutting room floor? And I know that might be a sore spot. I'm sure there's a lot of things you want to include as a filmmaker, and editing is tough. But
the harder part is figuring out which one to talk about.
Okay. Well, it doesn't have to be.
No, I know. But we spent 3 years making this film, and I think we interviewed 32 or 33 people all over the country, from two physician researchers, maybe is what I will call them. Hopefully, they're not listening and then get mad at that. But out of Boston, who are working on the concept of disrespect as a form of preventable harm, and how healthcare is diminished when that happens. We didn't put that in the film, but that passing through that, I think one example that I thought was really interesting was the psychology side of things, which does make a brief appearance in the film. I really wanted to get into the sort of crux of, what drives people to make errors? Like what are the most basic ways that happens, and just humanize the issue of errors, of mistakes. Right. It was tough to really grasp a hold of that. That didn't take us out onto a whole nother platform in this film. And two other small examples would be, we tried really hard. I had a brief meeting with Billy Bean, the GM of the Oakland Athletics, who's the designer of the Moneyball concept, and wanted to really bring him into the film because he's actually spoken at a number of health conferences to talk about that concept of running a business in the same way that they did, because they use data and statistics to take the less likely routes. And of course, they haven't won a World Series yet since they did it, but hey, they are a successful organization and they spend a lot less money. So we were so close to getting him and we didn't. And then I was like, well, maybe Theo Epstein, who's right down the street from me with the Cubs.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it. And so those aren't cutting room floor examples, but they're kind of examples of stories we would have liked to have told that didn't make the film. One thing that did reach the cutting room floor that I think is worth sort of looking into if people are interested was we went to Johns Hopkins and we interviewed some people at the Applied Physics Laboratory. And we talked about the sort of science of error in military weaponry and how precise they have to be, but how often they make mistakes as well. But when they make a mistake, innocent people die. People who had nothing to do with it, who weren't involved in the situation. And I think that's a really sort of prime example of things here. And for some reason, it just didn't fit. I think when you watch the film, you'll see it's packed pretty tight. There's a lot of information, and we tried to make sure that we stayed focused throughout the making of it. And when we realized that we could get Sully Sullenberger, we said, well, why don't we just kind of go deeper into the aviation thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and he's been a great advocate for improving patient safety, improving healthcare. And it's always great when people in healthcare are open to lessons from other industries, whether that's aviation, military. There's a lot of people who talk about books. General Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. Another book, a book from a naval ship captain. There's two books, It's Your Ship and Turn the Ship Around. And then there's examples that come from manufacturing that the audience for this podcast knows and appreciates. We've all been told that patients aren't cars. Well, of course, but there are, I think, a lot of lessons to learn from companies like Toyota and from other industries. And I think it's probably fair to say organizations that are making the most progress with improving patient safety aren't finding answers only within healthcare in terms of best practices or learning from other health systems. Outside ideas, even if they're not copied, hopefully spark a lot of thought and creativity and innovation.
Well, and something that infuriates me as I've gone along making and promoting and sharing this film is the occasional detractor who thinks it's not that easy. When when they hear something like actually, I just got somebody just did this on Twitter like today. We have a quote from Michael Melanson in the film where he says we could prevent many of these deaths immediately if we just put in the effort. Mm-hmm. Look, that's not that's not the end all be all answer. That is not how we're going to fix this problem with just goodwill and effort. But often, and I know one's saying it is, but that's the starting block. And oftentimes you'll see, people see this film or they see lines like that and they think that it's just this sort of, pie in the sky idea that, well, if we just want to do better, we can.
It's a start.
it's a start. And I think it's a really dangerous way to look at this problem only with numbers, only with hard, specific, concrete, one by one data. Evidence-based medicine was my dad's passion. It was his career. I want this film to be, something that stems from evidence. But I think that if you only look at things that are wildly perfect, that are just amazing, like, wow, this is exactly what's happening, you're going to miss the big picture on an issue that really is hard to tabulate. And one of the reasons why the number is, seems like it's rising. In 1998, it was 40 to 90,000. Now the numbers range from 250 to 440,000. That is not because it's getting worse.
Right.
In fact, it's the opposite. The healthcare industry is realizing that this is a serious issue, and they're putting in the effort to get a better understanding of how widespread it is. And I think if you had the same tools now as they had in 1998 when they were doing that research, I think that you would find somewhere around that same estimate range. And this is the beauty of science, and healthcare is science. And it's always going to be changing, and it's always going to be getting better. The question is, are you getting better or are you staying the same? Because you get worse or you get better. You don't stay the same. And I want every hospital to be thinking of it that way. And I want them to be thinking of how they can change their approach to really think about patients as part of the team.
Yeah, and your film does a really good job of presenting human stories, not just Sue Sheridan, her son Cal, her late husband Pat, but looking at the numbers and the underlying issues. So I think it did a really great job of not just highlighting the problem, but talking about solutions and ideas for the future. So I really want to thank you for the film. Thank you for shedding light on this issue, and I hope everyone finds a way individually or in a group setting to go find the film. So our guest today has been Mike Eisenberg, as he said earlier, part of the team that created a film being released January 22nd. To Err is Human, and you can find the website again, toerrishumanfilm.com. Mike, I'll leave it to you if you've got any other final thought for the audience.
Well, I'll feed off of what you just said a little bit too, to give some additional context on where people will find the film, because our initial release is iTunes for digital, and most big box stores, online stores, will have it, like Amazon, but also Walmart. And if you love to shop Walmart online, or Best Buy, Target, all them. But our hope is that through a successful launch by somewhat traditional filmmaking terms, we're able to reach then streaming platforms and potentially have the opportunity to be shared by PBS or a national network. I mean, this is a very real possibility for us. We're taking the long road. We're a small film, independent film. We raised our own money. We got a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to extend our funding, but we were vastly underfunded for a documentary. And through that, we did the best we could, but we're also kind of working grassroots for awareness and also for exposure. So the more people that watch this film, the more people that engage with it on social media and in other platforms like that, will show the world that not only is this film worth watching, but also this topic is worth talking about. And I think, people should start to think about films like ours, films like that HBO one, Bleed Out, or the Netflix one, Bleeding Edge, that, as an opportunity to support films about patient safety and about improving healthcare, because ultimately that's what we all want. We all want to see the healthcare system get better, be more reliable, and take care of patients the way that all the people who get into healthcare got into it for the reason in the first place. And I think films have a great way of bridging the gap between the outside world and the inside world of healthcare, and then have great conversations after it. And that's what we want to see.
Yeah. Well, I hope that all happens. You're right. I see here the pre-order page on Amazon for the Blu-ray and DVD. iTunes is the digital platform if people want to do streaming. Correct?
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I hope everyone goes and checks that out. I'll put links to everything on the blog post for this episode. So again, Mike Eisenberg, thank you so much for taking time today.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.